Bonjour à tous, bonjour à toutes. Bienvenue à notre 4e conférence de notre cycle 2021-2022, Connexions. Je profite de mon temps de parole en ouverture pour remercier les différentes instances qui ont participé au financement de notre projet. Merci au Véritable Center, à l'Association d'études juives canadiennes, au microprogramme en études juives de l'Université de Montréal, à la FICSUM et au professeur Naftali Kant du département de religion et culture de l'Université Concordia. Aujourd'hui, nous avons la chance d'accueillir Jordan Molot pour sa conférence Jewish Studies Beside the Jewish People, Space, Desire and the Affective Limits of Identity. En guise de présentation, Jordan est doctorant au département des religions et de culture de l'Université Concordia, faisant le lien entre l'histoire juive canadienne, la phénoménologie queer et les méthodes interdisciplinaires. Son travail vise à imaginer des études juives critiques en dehors du domaine de la politique identitaire. Comme à l'habitude, la présentation va être de 30 minutes, puis à la fin, on va avoir une période de questions bilingues. So now in English, hello everyone. Welcome to our 4th conference of our 2021-2022 lecture series cycle, Connexions. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the various organizations that have contributed to the funding of our project, the Vert Center, the Association of Canadian Jewish Studies, the microprogramme in Jewish Studies at Université de Montréal, the FICSUM, and to the Professor Naftali Kant of the Department of Religions and Cultures at Concordia University. Today, we are fortunate to welcome Jordan Molot for his lecture, Jewish Studies Beside the Jewish People, Space, Desire, and the Affective Limits of Identity. As a brief introduction, Jordan is a PhD student at the Department of Religions and Cultures at Concordia University, bridging Canadian Jewish history, queer phenomenology, and interdisciplinary methods. His work aims to imagine critical Jewish studies outside of realms of identity politics. As usual, the presentation will be half an hour, and at the end of the presentation, we will have a bilingual question period. Jordan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you for the introduction. Thank you for organizing the events, and also to all of the organizers behind the scenes. I'm very grateful to be offered this platform. And I also want to thank, of course, those of you who are joining in today. I hope to offer just sort of a few reflections on what was, and this still is sort of a project in development. Just a couple of ideas that I've had that have emerged in the context of some ethnographic work that I began doing in 2019 and finished in 2021. And I'm really excited to be able to have returned to them many months after submission to see where things still are, see where there are still issues that I was having. So with that in mind, I guess we can just get into it. I'll start the presentation now. Alex, can you just tell me if everything is good to go? I can't see anyone. Like an audible yes or no would be.
Right now, I don't see a PowerPoint.
Oh, sorry. Let me see this. Oh, no. Good to go? Perfect.
Yes, it's perfect.
Perfect. All right. Before going into the presentation, I'd like to pause momentarily to open with two considerations. The first is a land acknowledgement, which you are welcome to read below. This is a direct copy of the Concordia University's Indigenous Directions Leadership Group statement, which can be found on their website. It has become customary protocol in many university and non-academic settings to begin with a land or territorial acknowledgement. Such a recognition of the peoples over whose lands and waters we have been living and working over serves not only as an expression of gratitude, but also as a temporal disruption, a reminder of colonialism's ongoing presence. Within the university, this has had both material and immaterial effects, including ongoing barriers to equitable treatment faced by Indigenous students, staff, and faculty, but also the suppression and devaluation of indigenous knowledge systems and lifeways. And so I think it is worth reflecting very briefly how we as Jewish studies scholars can move beyond such liberal platitudes of recognition and begin thinking deeper about our structural and epistemological assumptions within the field. I don't claim at all to have any kind of definitive answer to this statement, but here I hope to offer at least some potential avenues of exploration for such an endeavor. This question has remained with me as I've entered doctoral studies and has led me to examine the origins of modern Jewish studies, or Wissenschaft, as it was described by its earliest proponents. That the earliest forms of what we would now call academic Jewish studies began in the context of simultaneous European Enlightenment, partial Jewish emancipation, and global imperial expansion, in my view, requires further consideration as it pertains to the ways we understand ourselves. In what ways did the desire to be incorporated into the imperialist European polity affect or construct Judaism in ways that implicate us in the Enlightenment quest for a singular truth? I've included in this slide an excerpt from Emanuel Wolf's On the Concept of a Science of Judaism, which served as the opening article for a short-lived yet very important Verein für Kultur, Wissenschaft der Juden, or the Association for the Culture and Science of Jews, in 1822, and outlines a program for the scientific study of Judaism. As I move along this presentation, I invite you all to think in relation to this founding text in its present day afterlives. And here I want to pay particular attention to the last sentence. All that has come forth from Judaism everywhere bears the imprint of a basic sort of fundamental idea, and this presentation will sort of challenge that. I'll get into it. I first arrived outside the colonial steam baths on a bright sunny Sunday afternoon. Though the weather was a kind of scathing cold only those familiar with Montreal winters can understand, and though I was anxious to get inside to begin my first ever bout of field work, I wanted to take my time entering the establishment in order to get a better sense of the space's layout and atmosphere. There is a certain feeling of stepping outside of time's progression as one goes up the first flight of stairs, from the lobby to the main locker room, which is perhaps a gentler way of stating that the building is very obviously older than most saunas, gay, Jewish, or otherwise. As one moves past the first door towards the attendant's desk, the semi-reflective beige tile of the stairway yields to a profoundly tacky feather patterned carpet, which, as several of my informants almost lovingly noted, has not been reupholstered for several decades, or at least for as long as any of them could remember. After paying the student rate and being handed a key and towel, I made my way across the turnstile to a pre-designated locker and slowly began disrobing, eager to observe the space for anything Jewish that I could hold on to and track. Established by an Ashkenazi Jewish family in 1914 in the heart of the Plateau neighborhood in Montreal, Colonial served both as a hygienic facility and social schwitzing and kibitzing institution within a majority Jewish migrant enclave, which until the 1930s had little access to domestic plumbing. By the mid-20th century, however, as many Jewish families migrated towards the city's suburban peripheries, the establishment gradually became a central site of Montreal's increasingly visible and vocal male homosexual community. I've included a couple of extra archival slides here just for everyone's enjoyment. So here we have a photo of two men on the left quite earlier. There's no date given from the photo, but of a man sitting on the terrace of Colonial. And the second is a man dumping what is a hot bucket of water onto the stone, into the stone oven. This would create a steam that was part of a ritual procedure, if you will, of many Jewish and now Russian men. This is just a little newspaper clipping taken from the 1960s. It's still today, to this day, the only or the last stone heated sauna in North America, and it is one of the oldest that are still in existence in the continent. This is a clipping from the film The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz, sort of a classic Jewish Canadian novel by Mordecai Rickler. And here we can see the protagonist on the right, Duddy Kravitz, entering the dry sauna, the same one that we saw 2 slides ago. And there's the towel reads, I don't know if you can read, it does say colonial there, and you can see some other men practicing the steam ritual. And Mordecai Rickler sort of become a through line, if you will, of a lot of my historical research. This is an excerpt taken from one of his lesser known stories titled The Main. And it's quite likely that this was in reference to Bains Colonial in the 30s during his upbringing. The colonial today is predominantly frequented by men having sex with men, first-generation Russian and Turkish migrants, and Hasidic men. Many continue to ascribe a peculiar kind of preserved original Jewish identity as the primary enabler of a generally peaceful coexistence of ethnic, religious, and sexual minorities. Pictured here in a 1998 feature in the McGill Daily titled Schwitz Like Me, Mila Ong Thwin observes how, quote, nothing in Montreal represents the mystique created by our palimpsest of a city better than the colonial baths. Originally established as a traditional European steam house, most of its current customers are gay men, but unlike the rest of Montreal's bathhouses, the new clientele at colonial baths has not completely usurped the older one. There is a coexistence of those who use the facilities for sexual encounter and those who carry on the traditional social and therapeutic ritual of going for a steam or schwitz. Alexandre Maltais and David Coussin echoed these observations 2 decades later in their article Partager d'entre-soi, homosociabilité et homosexualité dans un bain turc montréalais, which locates Jewishness as a key factor in how Colonial's peculiar history and physical layout enables its diverse clientele to, quote, live together side by side. First frequented by a Jewish population, they state, this centenary establishment gradually became a central site of Montreal's homosexual history, while preserving part of its original identity and allowing a generally peaceful coexistence of ethnic, religious, and sexual minorities within a closed space. Though not of concern to either works, this project will look into how and where the original identity, the characteristics of which are never really mentioned, where it is preserved, not to reject the claim as being necessarily untrue, but to get at more incisively how Jewishness is seen as operating within this particular space in the absence of its original clientele, and why and for whom this history continues to matter and materialize. Part 2. Over the last 2 decades, there's been a veritable boom within Jewish studies of works concerned with what it means to think about Judaism spatially. Though space has certainly mattered to Jews, what are the Garden of Eden, the temples, or the land of Israel, if not meaningful places? Other geographic dimensions of Jewish life have, until recently, been particularly undervalued within the Jewish tradition, and subsequently under-theorized across much Jewish studies scholarship. Indeed, the migrations of Jewish cultures has often been inflected as something of a problematic, whereby the Jewish experience is defined as one as, quote, profound displacement, lacking not only a proper territory, but also a substantial spatiality or attachment to place. As an ameliorative to this tendency, the new spatial turn of Jewish studies seeks, according to Liphart in their co-edited volume Jewish Topographies, to spatialize the historical as well as the cultural narrative of the Jewish experience, mapping not only the geography of Jewish expulsions and catastrophes, but also the geography of the Jewish everyday and the geography of Jewish hope, to make sense of the various ways space and place have mattered and continue to matter in Jewish communities here and elsewhere. But rather than presume Jewish space as something that is knowable in advance, that is, as a place where Jews are located, have been, or attach themselves to in different ways, this project approached spatiality as a structure of analysis, as an avenue from which to engage nascent critiques that interrogate how identity, or more directly, processes of identification, constitute Jewish studies as operative practices? What would it look like to approach the phenomenon of Jewish space and place with a decidedly different set of expectations and desires, ones that are less certain about what Jewish spaces are, how they are constructed, or where they can be found? A fundamental problem in what this project tried to get at is the identitarian expectation which places Jewish studies scholarship within a seemingly inescapable subject experience dyadic circuit, whereby Jewishness is both reinforced and made legible by a set of presumptive practices of who or what gets to be studied, and by extension, the materials such work citationally reproduce and canonize. Indeed, as Lila Corwin-Berman has forcefully argued in her recent essay, Jewish History Beyond the Jewish People, these elisions grant the very possibility of conducting such critical practices within Jewish studies altogether. Like most Jewish historians, she writes, I was trained to understand Jewish history as the history of the Jewish people and its movement through space. Thus, whether explicit or not, the first act of Jewish history is that of identification, of an individual, a group, a text, an object, an idea, or a piece of land. The foundational question, in other words, is not historical, but rather categorical. And though recent works in Jewish cultural studies, or quote, the new Jewish studies, have critically interrogated the field's over-reliance on such normative categorizations as tradition, diaspora, or authority in favor of heterogeneity, variety, and diffusion, these efforts still direct their attention to the bodies, objects, and territories that one might claim as verifiably Jewish. American Jewish literary scholar Benjamin Schreier pushes its intervention further, stating that, quote, the stuff of Jewish studies analysis may be continually in flux, revising and reinventing itself, even unfixed and inessentially constructed. But the categorical identity, that is, as Jewish, of the legibly Jewish entity continually resolving into an object of scholarly regard in such work, is never in any way disrupted. Below all the flux and revision and reinvention, an identitarian foundation remains quite stably and always already recognizably Jewish. Indeed, many of the works I have encountered on Jewish space have been framed along similar lines. In a 2021 article in the journal Canadian Jewish Studies, Jesse Tufexis calls upon scholars to examine, quote, the relationship between Jews and the Canadian landscape. What can be gleaned, he asks, from the early Jewish migrants whose memoirs often invoke imagery of unfamiliar surroundings as they sojourned inland from the maritime harbor. Quote, just as much as one could write about literary or mystical projection of Jewishness onto a perceived Canadian landscape, he notes, one could write about physical Jewish zones carved into rock, built upon and labeled with Hebrew script, signaling to the world their fundamental Jewishness. Though a turn toward the spatial enables for Tufexis a means of differently approaching, quote, the experience of uprootedness, of movement and transit, and of temporary settlement, central themes of the Canadian Jewish narrative imaginary, the possibility of such a project rests upon the presumptive existence of a translocal, transcultural Jewish subjectivity from which a fundamental Jewishness emanates. What precisely is Jewish about any of these spaces is simply never really explored or taken to task as itself an essentializing operation. Though critically inflected spatial considerations in Jewish studies aim to direct the reader's attention to the production of Jewish space, the Jew, or non-Jew, who is in fact being produced simultaneously, remains stable. Insofar as there is certainly value in looking towards space, place, and the geographic as a means of thinking with and about Jews, this project departs from this mode of critical scholarship by insisting that the ways Jewish can ever interact with spatiality is always already limited by a prediscursive Jewish referent and its respective experience, an equivocation which is paradoxically generalizable to an entire historical population, yet also specific to particular geotemporal coordinates. And so I wish to suggest more concretely that the potential of space lies not in its capacity to corroborate an already known Jewish subject, but in the possibility of rethinking the very categories that reproduce the conditions of such a subjectivity altogether. By displacing the assumption that Jewish studies is strictly the study of those bodies inscribed as Jewish and their relation to their external surroundings, a spatialized mode of thought can help us unmoor the ways we parochially theorize and render our objects of inquiry in order to develop new, spacious ways of understanding how Jewishness can be put to critical work. These questions are less rhetorical than they have been a crucial means from which I could make sense of my new field site. What began as an ethnographic study that sought to understand how sexuality and religion were co-constituted quickly became tied up in issues surrounding how or whether it were even possible to articulate the Jewishness of this space without projecting a reified transhistorical Jewish character onto it, as though it possessed some always already recognizable, though always unlocatable Jewish essence. Flattening its heterogeneous uses, as well as ignoring its physical transformations over its century-long existence. The question was no longer, how is this space Jewish, but rather, how and where and through what processes does this space still remain Jewish? And most importantly, what does it mean as a scholar of Jewish studies to be searching for such a location? Consider a story relayed to me by B, that's his acronym, or his metonym, a non-Jewish queer man in his mid-30s and one of 11 former or present frequenters of the establishment, interviewed as part of my research. Set on a Sunday evening during one of the, quote, cruisier times of the week, a group of around 10 had formed in the main shower area, roughly encircling 3 other men engaged in group sex over one of the 2 white marble massage tables. Quote, they were really just going at it, switching positions, moving around the whole room, seeing how people would respond. At first glance, this might appear to be an otherwise routine, if not entirely casual scene within the wider realm of gay urban cruising, which tends to depict gay bathhouses as erotic oases of sexual gratification and exploration. Ira Tattleman, an early scholar and historian of gay male cultures, suggested that, quote, through voyeurism and exhibitionism, consumption and control, tactility and motion, authority and inclination, the baths offer variety and opportunity and propose new ways to explore relationships between men, end quote, placing these sites at the center of a then nascent gay personal and political consciousness. Indeed, B's narrative suggests that the sex itself was less remarkable than the specific location within which it was being done, stating earlier in our interview that, quote, certain spaces in Colonial are different than others. Like, if you want to do something sexual with a guy, there are certain spaces where you are allowed to do that, Not everyone who uses the space is there for the same reason. Another informant explained to me that sexual activity usually takes place upstairs and in the wet saunas, while the dry sauna, locker area, and shared space were predominantly social. These zonings are not explicitly apparent, but have over many years developed as an intriguingly complex, symbiotic yet uneven choreography, whether temporally by coming at different times of the day and different days of the week, but also spatially through what I've called strategies of zone making. And I took this out of the main presentation, but it should be stated that an example of one of the strategies of zone making that I could think of off the top of my head were one of the older Jewish men who I interviewed told me that if they thought that something was going on around them, that they would turn up the temperature of the sauna to such an unbearable heat that only they could withstand, so that anyone who was not there to schwitz would leave. Needless to say, the main shower area, located next to the sauna rooms and hot tub, is not typically demarcated for sexual activity, but it was precisely this known boundary crossing that piqued B's interest, who chose to position himself against a wall so that he could watch both the group and the stairwell leading up to the main locker area. As the sex began to escalate, and as others continued to congregate around the exhibitionist trio, B noticed from the corner of his eye a figure descending from the top of the stairs, a, quote, seemingly Jewish man, older, full beard with peyot, bearing a certain aura of authority. Silently gesturing via eye contact to the three of this impending interruption, none appeared to be particularly fazed. In fact, one appeared excited by the fantasy turned reality of public sexual spectacle. No words had yet been uttered. As the older man continued his descent, B felt as though he were watching a car crash in slow motion, a clashing of worlds he could not look away from. Unsure of what would arise, he sat against the wall, eyes darting circuitously from one side of the room to the next, or to the other. The conclusion of this story is far less explosive than some might have anticipated. The older, presumably Hasidic man reached the bottom of the stairwell, sat down, quote, in the middle of it all, and continued on to the dry sauna without alarm. This clashing of worlds, that is, between Orthodox and queer, religious and secular, old and new, amounted to little more than a cursory glance, a rather anticlimactic collapse of easy readings and distinctions between these oft binarized groups. I want to suggest, however, that more can be gleaned from this encounter. Indeed, the breakdown of identity formations here enables us to think more clearly about both the discursive limits of identity and the points of affinity between these parallel trajectories. But in bringing these experiences together, the point is not that they are analogous. Far be it for me to deny the propulsive forces and repulsive forces of identification. Rather, I want to propose that Jewishness can be gleaned horizontally, that the distribution of feelings or affects across space provides a means of conceptualizing a present Jewishness in absence. How can we think about Jewishness not only as emanating from a verifiable Jewish subjectivity, but also as a projection from which B, a non-Jew, imbued another with authority? I suggest that the narrativized history of the Baths itself contributed to this authorization. It is here, I argue, where the site's original identity becomes embedded as a recognition of precedent, giving present actions, rituals, and gatherings a distinct symbolic weight and emotional valence. Jewishness becomes less a single kind of act, performance, or identity, and more a heterogeneous system and ecological field produced by and through particular forms of historical repetition, a lineage enacted both in stories shared about the space and the gestures, movements, and memories collected within. This experiential intersection of queerness and Jewishness suggests, moreover, that these valences cross-hatch and bind to one another. M, a queer Jewish artist now based in Paris, describes his overlapping relationship to Colonial in mutually reinforcing ways, whereby the unique social nature of the space enabled an opportunity to think more about his non-sexual relationship to the sauna. When asked how he sees Jewishness within Colonial, he returned to some childhood memories. And here I'll quote them at length because they were particularly illuminating and generative for this project. He states, I guess I have more of an ambivalent relationship to my Jewish identity than to my gay identity. And I think that Jewishness matters to me. It comes and goes. It's constantly shifting and something I don't care. And sometimes I don't care and other times I really care. My Jewish identity has always been very connected to a kind of cultural history of my family and place. And so I grew up building my sense of Jewish identity around very familial events and shapes and senses. The phenomenology of my Jewishness is very much linked to my grandparents' house in Montreal and things that aren't necessarily Jewish for other people. And yet I think that my Jewish identity is also connected to a sense of longing, which is not without eroticism, which is where I think it links with my queer identity. So I don't have Jewish religion weighing down on my sexuality, but I do have a certain kind of, I guess, affects that come from my Jewish cultural identity, like longing, like epigenetic histories of trauma, that link very easily with my sense of queerness and sexuality. And so even though, for example, when I see Hasids walking around the Jewish quarter in Paris, there is a feeling inside me like, we're not a Hasidic family, like I don't belong to them. They don't belong to me. And yet it evokes something in me that I feel. Feelings, which so often exceed the categories we fit them into, serve both as a means of placing Jewishness and queerness in relation to their surroundings, providing a bridge from which queer and Jewish subjectivities can inform one another without occupying either category comfortably. And though the emotions and attachments described within and about Colonial by my informants are interwoven by and produced through their respective subjectivities, attending to the affective contours of their stories, the ways they circulate between and across identities, the ways they linger in space as impressions or haunting traces, enables us to think through these expectations more capaciously. Jewishness, then, represents a set of multivalent affects, an uneven distributed network of history and performativity that all bodies, regardless of their identification with or against Jews, could be entangled within, depending on who is seeking it out. In this last section, which I need to clarify, is still very much in development and is something that upon review of the original essay, I realized needed a little bit more work. So I'm using this as a sort of reminder of that. I want to briefly suggest that a possible way of accessing these traces is by linking it to the concept of desire. Indeed, for Benjamin Schreier, desire already operates within and constitutes the very practices organizing Jewish studies. Jewish studies is hegemonic institutional formation, and as such lends itself well to his goal of critically reframing the field's reliance on a normative Jewish subject. Representation, he writes, cannot be thought to organize our field because the possibility of representation is in fact organized by the constitutive activity of the field. Much of what we can actually point to as being categorically represented in a given text is a spectral product of our interpretive desire. Indeed, much of what was described in the previous section could be understood along desiring lines, longing, affection, sex, memory, and so forth. But it is also through desire from which my own work as a scholar interested in Jewishness which opens the very possibility of such an endeavor to find such traces of Jewishness and to think of it differently and spaciously. Desire, then, is both a historical and temporal phenomenon circulating and enabling the location of colonial steam baths, as well as a position from which this project is engendered. I think there is more, however, I think there is more potential to desire than even Schreier lets on. Consider Lauren Berlant's description of desire as both a state of attachment to something or someone and the cloud of possibility that is generated by the gap between an object's specificity and the needs and promises projected onto it. It is this gap which, in my view, lends itself productively to both Schreier's vision and my own work, precisely because of its impossibility to capture definitively. Lauren Berlant suggests, desire visits you as an impact from the outside, and yet inducing an encounter with your affects makes you feel as though it comes from within you. This means that your objects are not objective, but things and scenes that you have converted into propping up your world. I got a bit distracted there. And so what seems objective and autonomous in them is partly what your desire has created, and therefore is a mirage, a shaky anchor. If it is desire which enables my queer reading of a given Jewish text, it is also a collective desire that renders such texts as Jewish prior to my encounter. Such was the difficulty in my own experience at Colonial, which I began to, and will now return to as this presentation nears its end. Despite my best intentions and excitement to examine what I called in one of my earliest project proposals a, quote, living Jewish relic, the preliminary task of locating Jewishness proved far more difficult than anticipated. Indeed, one thing this project consistently grappled with in trying to understand Jewishness as it functioned at Colonial was the near impossibility in finding such stable, visible proofs. It is one thing to talk about how Jews historically frequented or lived around this site, or how their memories attach themselves to it, or that the founders and present owners are Jewish, or that Hasidic men still go there sometimes, but it is quite another to then characterize and claim the bathhouse itself as Jewish, particularly when Jews have largely left the space behind. The late Jose Esteban Munoz's work on the ephemeral is especially useful here. For him, the key to queering evidence, that is, the ways in which we prove queerness and read queerness, is by suturing it to the concept of ephemera. Think of ephemera as trace, the remains, the things that are left hanging in the air like a rumor. Ephemeral evidence is rarely obvious, furthermore, because it is needed to stand against the harsh lights of mainstream visibility and the potential tyranny of the fact. Put differently, the fact of Jewish absence, or perhaps the absence of Jewish visibility, overshadows exploring what is left behind of what remains in the wake of loss. For Munoz, ephemera are absent and they are present, disrupting a predictable metaphysics of presence, in that the actions which terminated long ago can continue to be found by those looking for it. It partially relives in its projection and documentation. What is absent is not necessarily lost, but can be envisioned as taking on new forms that reverberate in unanticipated ways across time and space. Loss and absence are not coterminous with death and negativity, at least not determinatively so. Let me conclude for a moment to reflect on what I have just said, what I am trying to say, and more particularly what I am not saying. I am not saying that Jewish studies should solely be concerned with its externalities, or that it should define itself in non-Jewish terms. Certainly there is value in working with canon, both old and new. But it appears to me that we ought to try as many ways as possible in developing a language and praxis that is never satisfied or certain about what, where, and especially who we are looking at. As such, I am less interested in providing a definitive answer or cure to a problem of my own making than in mapping out lines of resistance against the foundational certainties over which Jewish studies rests, and in creating spacious conceptual realms from which disparate experiences and historic processes can be brought together. Such an exercise, then, is not meant to expand Jewishness into absurdity, but to untether it from its center. It is to think more thoroughly about what Jewish identification, however shifting, takes for granted, and how attention to phenomena peripheral to its normative gaze can give rise to new ways of approaching and appreciating Jewishness as it circulates, operates, and distributes itself across the widest possible discursive range. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Arden, for this amazing presentation. And I would like to open the period for questions and maybe discussions. So I know we are 18, but if you want, you can raise physically or digitally your hand and talk directly to Jordan. It feels good. Donc, je vais aller en français aussi. Hein, donc, j'ouvrirai la période de questions. Même si on est 18, je pense que vous pouvez lever la main physiquement ou digitalement, puis directement vous adresser à Jordan. If there's no question right away, I might ask you one if it's okay with you.
Absolutely. And I should say, I find with these Q&As, there's like a really interesting dynamic where, you know, the question is asked and by answering, I'm somehow like the voice of authority or I authorize certain things. I'm much more interested in having sort of the discussions and responses, as this is still very much a work in progress, always in development. Thank you.
So, and I ask you a question and I don't have also the answer, so it's not a rhetorical question. Sure, so sure. I know that you mentioned that your project doesn't pursue normative goals. However, do you think that understanding space through a critical stance, combining desire and queer phenomenology, creates a way out of what might be called a cruel optimism, understood as what Berlin would define as when the object or the scene that ignites a sense of possibility actually makes it impossible to attain. The expensive transformation for which a person or a people risks striving. And then, so, of what might be called a cruel optimism of the disciplinarization of GS or Jewish studies.
That's a really good question. I've never read Cruel Optimism, though I understand it to be a really central text that's offered a lot of people who I look up to a lot to work with. I'm not sure. That's like just a very interesting question. That I think certainly what I was trying to get at in this project was not necessarily like a way out, a way to, or a way of abandoning what exists, but rather in sort of tracing these foundational, these stable forms or these stable assumptions that we were making. I wanted to just like unsettle it just a little bit to see what could come about it. I think the language that I use and that I borrow is very, within the presentation, is bold and assertive, but I think the intentions behind it are just a little bit more humble, I guess. And the way going forward, I'm not sure the extent to which, you know, I keep on thinking back to the quote that you told me, and I'm getting fumbled by it. But I guess my point, the point that I'm trying to make is not so much an abandonment or a problematization of the entire discipline of Jewish studies, but rather just to get us thinking about these assumptions that we make and how that limits us to think about Jews or Judaism more generally. There's another aspect that sort of informed my thinking that I didn't bring up, not even in the paper form of this talk, and that is sort of these ongoing conversations by Jews of color, queer Jews, Mizrahi Jews, particularly people in Jewish studies who are working in Sephardic studies. These notions of Ashkenormativity, Ashkenazi centrism really informed some of the ideas that I was having. I noticed that a lot of the responses to the work or to the challenge which the label Ashkenormativity provides was saying things like, well, we just need to add more voices, and we need to have more people interested in like queer Jews or Mizrahi Jews or trans Jews or these things, these additional sort of this balkanizing, it's like a balkanizing effect where we're just trying to like account for every possible avenue of Jewishness. It's like this conjunctive practice that takes Jewishness and then labels it next to, you know, some new identity form, rather than having Jewishness itself challenged and problematized. That's sort of the thing that I was trying to get at. Not sure if that answers your question.
Yes, it does.
Okay, good.
And thank you for this generous answer. Seriously.
Sure.
Yes. Oh, let's go. Raphael, you can take the lead.
Yeah, Jordan, I was just wondering if you could tell us more about the process of recruiting the participants and how that went. Like how, because I remember you said at some point in a different talk that you had more participants than you expected. So how did that match your expectations when you initially put out the call for participants?
Hi, Ralph. Thank you for the question. I was really nervous bringing up or try like with the that I was worried that no one would be interested in speaking with me about this really niche topic. Like I didn't know how many people, you know, went to Colonial or whatever. So I started really small, just sort of asking people I knew that if they knew anyone who had been to Colonial or frequented Colonial, if they could get in touch with me, or if they were interested in speaking about it. And I should also say that I knew a couple of people who are frequent, or I do know people who are frequenters of Colonial itself. It ended up being more of a snowballing effect, which I think it may or may not have, it certainly did affect the sort of results that I was finding. But for instance, my mother told someone about the project, and then they had found a man, or someone's grandfather had gone there in his youth, and then I spoke to him, and then he said, "Oh, well, I love talking about the baths. It was one of my favorite things to do up until 10 years ago." They were very excited to talk to me about it, and then that just sort of kept on going, and it ended up with a pretty substantial data set. That was the Jewish men, and then the queer men I posted on Instagram, and it just sort of really, really took off. I had to tell people that I couldn't speak to them anymore.
Perfect. Rafa, do you have a follow-up, or I pass to another person?
No, I'm good, thank you.
Perfect. David Kaufman, you can.
Thanks. Thank you, Jordan. This is really stimulating paper. And as a former anthropologist, I appreciate the difficulties of approaching ethnographically this subject, and the ambition of your intervention. I say I'm a former anthropologist. I still have anthropologist questions in mind, but I'm incorrigibly historian now, in the sense that I think time is important. I mean, you made good intervention about thinking about space, but I'm curious about the time aspect, and in particular, I'm thinking about the kind of transition period or moments, or what happens over different periods of time between when this place was once used by, people who identify as Jews going to the Schwitz, and later, like there's a transition period. And I'm wondering about historical sources, either oral histories or traces from, any sorts of historical traces. And if you have any interest in, or could provide some insight about the kind of change over time, the process of the, of the ways this space is understood, and how the Jewishness of it morphs.
Thank you for the question, Professor Kaufman. Thank you for coming. I definitely suppressed the more historical aspects of the paper in this presentation. As I said before, upon review of this paper that I hadn't looked at it for several months.
Sorry, you hit the mute button by mistake.
Yes.
How'd that happen? Anyway, when did I cut off? I'll just repeat the whole thing. You
said you had it. You kind of put it aside for this project. Yeah, you can start again. Get your thoughts.
The review itself. The goal of the project was just to sort of combine and find these these through lines of the whole paper, because I've realized upon review that I was dealing with a lot of ideas. Some were more developed than others. So I wanted to just sort of find one narrative thread and then present upon it. And I think it's evident that this time around I was more anthropologically focused than historically minded. To answer like the more historical points, the resources that I used, I was actually not able to find a lot of information on Colonial in archival materials. The Canadian, or the Jewish Canadian Archives, has an interview by one of the old owners from 1989 that was illuminating in some ways, but he was more interested in talking about the operations of Colonial. It was a radio interview. So I had to sort of look at the broader picture of bathhouses in the city and in North America more generally. So I was able to sort of look at other Russian and Turkish bathhouses, predominantly in New York City, to sort of find, I used it as sort of an analogously, alongside some historical documentation of the bathhouses that were in Montreal that emerged from the late 19th century into the early 20th century. The phenomenon of bathhouses and public baths was in a particular period of mass migration, obviously, where people who arrived into the city had little to no money and were also a public health hazard. So the city invested quite a bit of money in developing a sort of bathhouse network. So there are a lot of these neighborhood bathhouses that were ethnically inflected. So for example, there's an old bathhouse up the street from me on Adedecan and Ontario. Sorry, I realize not everyone here is from Montreal. It's sort of the eastern part of the city, and the architecture of it very much corresponds to sort of Ukrainian influence. So there was Ukrainian bathhouses, there were French Canadian bathhouses as well that incorporated these little details. To my knowledge, the Colonial was the only one in Plateau that had these sort of like particular like Jewish things about it. There was a mikveh at one point that I didn't get to discuss in this presentation, but would have loved to. And sort of responded to a very particular kind of bath or sauna culture that emerged within the shtetl. Like these other bathhouses, as indoor plumbing became more and more common, there became sort of an economic vacuum, if you will, whereby a lot of these institutions shut down because there was no longer interest. So we went from having about 30 bathhouses in 1910 to I think 7 or 8 that were still operational by 1930 or 1940. This is a time when the proportion of people with indoor plumbing or access to indoor plumbing went from, I think, 10% to over 90%, so very rapid industrialization. And I think there are some gay historians who have theorized that vacuum, where there was like sort of an absence of clientele, enabled or forced the management of these establishments to be more open to allowing gay clientele or men seeking men into the spaces. So this is where the sort of strategies come in, and where these like temporal regimes come in. So there's some articles on the St. Mark's Bath in New York City, for example, that say that Jewish men or businessmen would come in the day, and then gay sex would happen at night, and sort of things like that. So that seems to have been the period from the 1930s to the 1950s. During the 1960s and 70s, as gay liberation became more popular and mainstream, the bathhouse itself became a central institution for this sort of collective consciousness raising exercises, very particular to like predominantly white gay males. Another thing I didn't get to talk about in the presentation was that the Colonial was also a site of police raids across the 60s, and I think that's really important as well. I rambled on for a little bit, but I hope that answers some of your historical minded questions.
It does. Let me just, speak a word of encouragement. I think it's a really, really interesting project, and it's got really a lot of great potential, particularly with a historical and ethnographic fusion. And if it's a study that's really at the border between, Jewish studies and gay studies, I think there's really a lot to be done, a lot to be said across the country, and as a North American sized project. So, I mean, I know you have other dissertation project, it seems, on the go, but I would encourage you to think about it broadly and, add to it when you can, because it would be a fantastic book. And I could envision lots of different ways of going and making pretty interesting contributions in addition to the specific theoretical one that you had in mind today.
Thank you so much, Professor. That is really kind of you to say. I just read your article for a class the other day on that. So you're very much in my mind already. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Magdalene. You can go.
Yeah, thank you so much for this, Jordan. I really love listening to it. And I also loved seeing these pictures that I hadn't got to see before. I wanted to ask you a sort of small or big question, depending on how you want it, about how masculinity functions in your analysis here, because you've been talking sort of primarily about like sexuality and religion, but I think there's this connecting line between who's going to this path in terms of masculinity, and I'm curious how that affects your interpretation, but also what that makes possible in sort of interactions between very different groups in like a small and sweaty space, basically, I guess. So. Yeah.
Hi, Magdalene. Thanks for coming, and thank you for the question. One of the issues, or the personal issues that I had throughout the entire project was sort of evaluating the limit, like the project's limits and scope. I was very cognizant, thanks to many professors in my undergrad, particularly one, Gozar Sharanya, who taught me queer theory, about this sort of universal figure, this universal gay male subject that gets interwoven within so much of like queer theoretical work, Michel Foucault being a primary example of that. With that in mind, there were, I mean, it's just that's sort of just to say I was very cognizant of it, and it certainly is like acted as a limitation. I think I tried as an ameliorative, or as a way of balancing out, I really tried to focus on like the theoretical aspects of the project, sort of using the theory first, that then got complemented by the sort of fieldwork that I was interested in. I'd definitely have to think about masculinity further. It was an aspect of my initial proposal, but then due to time constraints, it got sort of left behind. I appreciate the question.
Do we have a follow-up, Magdalene? Oh, Magdalene, no. I will leave the last question to Professor Khan. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Jordan. Really great to hear you speak. You always have great insights. And I just thinking about some of I mean, there's so much going on in the talk, and so I just thought I'd reflect on some of the points that stood out to me, and some for further inquiry. You know, one is you sort of set up as a challenge to Jewish studies, and maybe it seems to me more that you're just pushing for using the category more non-essentially than it's often used. And I very much appreciate the way you used affect in particular, a kind of Jewish affects, a Jewish affective framework, as one way of showing how Jewishness is constructed and Jewish identification is made. But then you complicated it by showing this as a space where Jews and Jewishness is just one of the kind of identities that's in play. And I guess for me, one of those places where I would love to hear more is, you know, you mentioned someone who is both gay and Jewish. And so that, you know, the space is a manifestation of those intersectional identities for that person. And so to me, it would be interesting to see that people, or that person, or people who have these kind of, you know, it could also be someone who's Russian and gay, or Russian and Jewish. You know, there are multiple intersections going on here, but how their practice in those spaces, how the affects in those spaces, zoning, as you said, spatialization through zoning, specifically at intersections, I thought would be really interesting. I don't know if you have something to say on that. Well, I'll leave it at there. Lots more I'm sure we can discuss at other moments.
Thank you, Naftali. Thank you for coming. It's nice to see you. Yeah, the person I spoke to, the gay Jewish artist, it was a really wonderful conversation. We got to, it was the sort of resonances between both of our lives sort of created a really interesting and generative dialogue. It was less of an interview and more of a, I think the excerpt that I added to that I included in the presentation sort of speaks that it was like not, I wasn't just asking him questions, but we were very much sort of co-creating knowledge. I actively avoided the intersectional language in this project, not out of any qualms with it, but just because again, sort of going back to one of the questions that was posed earlier, so often like gay and Jewish, trans and Jewish, Sephardi Jewish, all of these different sort of like conjunctive practices stabilize this Jewish category, you know, so as opposed to the other way around, let's say. So the intersection theory, which is valuable for in so many ways, I think is limited in that it continues to rely on this sort of unspoken foundation of what Jewishness is. I definitely have to do more work. Yeah, I cannot emphasize enough that this is like, that this project is development and something that I am by no means stating is finished. But I think the intersectional language and the intersectional grammars that are so sort of dominant within contemporary Jewish studies is something that I'm like trying to challenge in a way, just by stating that when we add these sort of dashes in between gay and Jewish or whatever, something remains stable, you know. The gay becomes this thing, or the first part becomes this thing that can be in flux, but the Jewish part is still stable. Happy to chat with you more about it later, of course. Meeting coming up.
So as the hours is kind of ending, let me gently conclude our discussion. So thank you, Jordan, again. And also thanks also to you, dear participants that are still there, even though the hour is a bit past. Let me invite you all to our next lecture that we will be in French, which is going to be Les modernités maghrébines juives multiples, le cas de la communauté juive des Arrois au Maroc, on February 16th. So thanks again, everyone, for being here. Thanks, Jordan. We really appreciate your presence.
Thank you so much, and thank you again to the organizers and everyone who's come here. It means a lot to me. Thank you.